We are locking in our final predictions for Tennessee football and moving on to the season. It is week 1, and welcome into the Volunteer State. I'm Blake Toppmeyer, alongside the Knoxville News Sentinels, Adam Sparks and John Adams. We've been kicking around predictions for Tennessee since really probably the winter, and some of those predictions have evolved. Some of them have remained true. We'll get into that on the pod today and look ahead at Tennessee's chances as well for the college football playoff. We won't learn probably too much about that in this week 1 game against Chattanooga, but we might learn a little bit more about the SEC depending on what happens in some non-conference games elsewhere. So I want to start with this. Adam, I saw you had your game-by-game predictions in Knox News this week for Tennessee's season. To the surprise of no one, you predicted they would win their week 1 game. But the real headline was you picked Tennessee to finish 9-3. I know throughout the offseason you were kind of debating anywhere from 8-4 to 10-2. It seemed like you settled on 9-3, and it was interesting, I thought, how you got there. So kind of take us through it a little bit, summarize how you decided to land on your game-by-game predictions for Tennessee.
Yeah, I hate the game-by-game. We have to do it. I understand why people are just interested in it. I like more of whenever I pick game-to-game, I start with the end result, the record, and then sort of work my way back, sort of a feel of what this team is. And I've usually gotten pretty close when I've done it that way. And I have the feel that this is about a 9-3 team. I think, I've seen the over-under. Most places I've seen the over-under is 8.5 for Tennessee. I would definitely go over on that. Again, I think they're going to go about 9-3. I think 9.5 should probably be the over-under because I was leaning harder to 10-2 than I was 8-4. The way that I did the game by game is I've got them beating NC State, losing a close one to Oklahoma, losing to Florida, but beating Alabama. Now, do I think, will I pick it that way when we get to the week-to-week picks? Probably not. But I had to find a third loss. And another gut feel of mine is I think they're going to beat Alabama this year. We'll get that when we get to the Alabama week. But I just feel like the transition from Nick Saban and Kalen DeBoer, that being a home game, Tennessee's really good. I think they'll get better as the year goes on. I think Tennessee's about a 9-3 team. Whether or not they would lose to Florida, I've gotten a lot of flack over that one, but I had to pick a third loss. And, they shouldn't have lost to South Carolina 2 years ago. From a preseason perspective, they shouldn't have lost to Missouri last year. So there has been a letdown game each of the last 2 years. That's the one that I picked for this one. Could have been any letdown game, I guess, but I feel more confident in 9-3 than I do any particular game, though.
John, throughout the preseason, you've consistently been at 10-2 for Tennessee. Adam and I have been hanging out more in the 9-3 range. You've been in that 10-2 Tennessee to the playoff category. Tell us, why are you so bullish on Tennessee, and is there any thought of fading the Vols here and backing away from that 10-2 prediction as we lock in our final picks here?
Well, I think it's very logical to say 9-3 based on what we've seen. I think Tennessee will be favored in 10 of its games, and so I'm basically saying it will win all the games it's supposed to win. It hasn't really done that under Josh Heupel the last 2 years. The horrific loss to South Carolina in 22, and then last year's loss to Florida in the Swamp. So I think Adam I can understand why Adam would say 9-3, and you might too, that Tennessee will lose a game it's supposed to lose. I really believe in Nico Iamaleava. I just think he will pull them through on a bad day. That's a lot to ask for a player who's never started a regular season game. He has that one start in the Citrus Bowl, of course, but I really believe in him. I think he'll be really good, and I think a great quarterback can make a difference in close games. So when you start looking for a game Tennessee would lose, I think losing to Oklahoma in Norman is a very realistic possibility, and losing to Georgia, I mean, everybody expects that pretty much. Josh Heupel probably expects that. Can't say it, though. And then the third game, though, Who are the candidates? Well, Florida, because of its history, as Adam pointed out. NC State is not a lock. Some people think Arkansas. I mean, Tennessee will be a decided favorite. It's not very good, but there have been some strange games in the past between Tennessee and Arkansas. And Arkansas has a couple of epic upsets over Tennessee in the time I've been here, even though they don't play regularly. But by going 10-2, I'm saying Tennessee will win the games it's supposed to win. And I think the line on the Alabama game will probably be basically pick 'em. Tennessee might be a 2 to 3 point favorite.
Adam, your game picks are particularly interesting because, as you mentioned, it's sometimes hard to get to a particular record. You go game by game, you got to find a way to get there. But I didn't think it was, out of the realm of possibility of you picking Florida to beat Tennessee because we know the history there. It's interesting because I almost feel like that Florida loss is kind of the forgotten game of last season. When you talk to Vols fans, they sort of bring up the games that they felt like they could have won in the 2022-2023 seasons, but didn't. And of course, that conversation starts with the 2022 loss at South Carolina. But then the conversation usually moves to the bludgeoning Tennessee endured in Columbia, Missouri last year. But by that point in the season, Missouri had established itself as a really good team. And so I actually think when you reflect back on last season and say, what was the game that Tennessee probably should have got and for whatever reason just didn't function on the road that particular day? I think it was that game in the Swamp. That's kind of the forgotten game of last year. Tennessee lost by 2 touchdowns in the Swamp, and its demons in that venue continued. Now this year at Neyland, we know Josh Heupel beat Florida at Neyland a couple years ago, but as you look at that game a little bit more, I know it's a few weeks out, but I guess how pivotal do you think that is for both of these programs? I mean, we know what's facing Billy Napier. He's on the hot seat coming into this season. But I think, when it comes to Josh Heupel's reputation and his goodwill with Tennessee fans, I think beating Florida at home this year, important game for him.
Yeah, I mean, Florida is now just a nemesis. It's not a team that you necessarily fear, but you're concerned about like the atmosphere of the game, the sort of the hex that Florida can have over you. If you think about the Florida game last year, it was early, which Florida games in the past have been early. This one's a little later, so that's a different take on it. But the Florida game last year basically told you immediately, hey, this is not a playoff team. This is not a team like 2022. This is going to be a different level team, a lower level team, regardless of what happens after this. It's just not there. It also showed sort of the fragile nature of last year's team. Cooper Mays was hurt in that game. You lose your center, suddenly you can't function. The quarterback could not function in that. Once you got past these, any starters on the offensive line, the twos could not hold up in that environment. The secondary, which had some problems last year, could have as many or more problems this year. They were not good. They were terrible in that game. Coverage against just an okay quarterback. Tackling was terrible. And so the Florida game last year showed you that you can go from a national title contender to just a pretty good but not great team. And by the way, I think NC State this year, that game has sort of the same ramifications. Like that's a top 25 team. It's an ACC team. It's not on the road, but it is a neutral site game. It's not a full-fledged road game, but it is a neutral site game. If Tennessee wins that one, you can say, okay, now what? Now where does this go? If Tennessee were to lose that one, you would immediately say, okay, any talk of playoff, just take that off the table. This team is probably going to be, one level below that.
It seems like I agree with you, Adam, that the line is interesting with Tennessee because we've seen throughout a lot of the offseason it be at 8.5. Some books I think now have bumped it up to 9 even, but I kind of agree with you, Adam. I more handicap Tennessee at 9.5. Do you go with 9-3? Do you go with 10-2? We have a split opinion on this podcast. Me and Adam have 9-3. John has 10-2. But I mean, 9-3 versus 10-2. is probably going to be the difference in playoffs versus not. I mean, I think the general perception around college football is if you're from the SEC and you're 10-2, that's not a guarantee you're going to get one of the playoff at-large bids, but you're in pretty good position to get a playoff at-large bid at 10-2, and at 9-3, you're probably not getting a playoff at-large bid, and particularly with Tennessee's schedule, which does not rank among the toughest in the SEC, I do not think Tennessee would get a playoff bid at 9-3. How do you think 9-3 would be perceived by Vols fans in this year 4 under Josh Heupel? Because if we rewind this a little bit, Heupel came in with really not much expectations for his first season, coming off the heels of the Jeremy Pruitt saga, the ongoing NCAA investigation at that time. Wasn't a lot of expectation for year 1, and I think Heupel met or exceeded the bar. Then in year 2, he blows everybody away with Hendon Hooker and was knocking right on the door of the 4-team playoff until that loss at South Carolina. But most was forgiven there based on how special that season was, how thirsty Tennessee fans were for a season like that, and you throw in the fact they beat Alabama. That was the gold star. And then last year was sort of maybe just like a treading water. I don't think Tennessee fans were perturbed necessarily by how last season went, but it was just kind of a shrug of the shoulders like, okay, this was a transitional year from Hendon Hooker to Nico, and Tennessee went 9-4. That's acceptable. But now in year 4 with Nico, it seems like the expectations are ratcheting up a little bit. And within the fan base, it's like, I think in February, you probably heard a lot of 9-3, but now as the season is nearly here, I'm hearing more and more of 10-2 or even 11-1 and playoff expectations from this fan base. So is it playoff or bust this year for Josh Heupel? And I don't mean bust as in Tennessee's going to fire him or put him on the hot seat, but perception of the season. Is it playoff or bust, do you think, for Tennessee this year?
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. If Tennessee doesn't get to the playoff, I think most of the fan base is going to lose its mind, because the difference between getting into the playoffs before and not getting into the playoffs was just there are elite national title contenders, and then there's a lot of other really good teams. There was a clear separation. Now with the 12-team playoff, you are in or you're out, and everybody in the SEC, or not everybody, but most teams in the SEC think we should be in this year. It's not 12 teams. It's easy to get in. You can lose a couple and you get in. It's no big deal. So I think there are a lot of teams now, a lot of fan bases that assume that their team can get in and should get in. And the chasm between who's in the playoff now and who's out of the playoff just it widened in terms of perception. Think of the last two seasons you referenced there. The great 2022 season, they finish in the Orange Bowl. Last season was a disappointment to some extent. They won 8 games in the regular season. They ended up in the Citrus Bowl. Ask SEC fan on the street, what's the difference between the Orange Bowl and the Citrus Bowl? Yeah, they're both really good, but not the absolute best place you want to be at in the postseason. They're both in Florida, and really good, but not great teams usually end up there. And so I think that there's a chasm now that's going to grow with teams that are in the playoff or out of the playoff. It's similar to like college baseball. Either you get to Omaha or you don't get to Omaha, and nobody cares that you lost in the super regional. Losing in the super regional and losing in the regional and whatever, they're all kind of the same when you get a little down the road and you look back at a season. What people want to know is, did you or did you not get to Omaha? Now it's going to be, did you or did you not get into the 12-team playoff? And so if Tennessee gets close but doesn't get in, I think it'll hurt a whole lot more than last season did when you didn't get up in the top 10, but you still went to the Citrus Bowl. It was fine.
John, your take on that. Adam says Vols fans will lose their minds if Tennessee doesn't make the playoffs. Well, I mean, we've never seen that from Tennessee fans before, have we? You're sitting here predicting playoffs. So what happens if Tennessee doesn't make the playoffs? How's that going to go over in East Tennessee?
Well, I agree with Adam, and I got one email from a reader, one of my regular literary contributors, who said that Tennessee doesn't make the playoff, Josh Heupel should be fired. So
Level-headed thought.
I've gotten those too, John.
Yeah, you probably got them from the same guy. But no, I think the fan base in general will be devastated if Tennessee doesn't make the playoff. As Adam put it, this is what college football has become. It's no longer having a winning season, making a bowl game, making a New Year's bowl game. It's, did you make the playoff? If you didn't, we'll talk to you next year. I think a couple of things factor into that. Tennessee's got Nico at quarterback for probably just 2 seasons as full-time starter. So that's a big plus. You've got who's one of Tennessee, who should turn out to be one of Tennessee's best quarterbacks. That's a plus. The schedule this year and next is very favorable by SEC standards. When you get to play this year, Vanderbilt, Arkansas, and Mississippi State, 3 of the worst teams in the SEC, according to preseason predictions, that's a plus. Florida's still down, and you get Florida at home, even though it is a nemesis. And then you've got Alabama, Georgia, and Oklahoma. Well, you win 2 out of 3 and beat everybody else that you're supposed to beat. You're in probably with 10-2. Now, if Tennessee went 10-2 and didn't make the playoffs, the fans would be devastated, and they would be blaming the playoff selection committee, not the Vols. So that would be different. But I just think this season and next, the schedule is as favorable probably within the conference as it's going to get for Tennessee. And the Vols need to capitalize on it. I think most fans realize that.
Boy, you guys are making me feel like I'm going a little easy on Tennessee, because I was going to say it's not playoff or bust, that 9-3 would, it wouldn't be welcomed with open arms, but it would be an acceptable result. I was looking at it more through a 2-year lens, sort of going off the point you were making, John. I think a lot of Tennessee fans probably think they get 2 years here with Nico. Could get more, but I think the expectation is Nico is going to be a star. He'll be the starter for 2 years, and then he'll go to the NFL. And so my thought was Heupel needs to get to the playoff a minimum of 1 time in this 2-year span with Nico, but he doesn't have to do it back-to-back years here. He's got 2 shots at the apple. Get to the playoff at least once in the next 2 years with Nico. But you guys got your finger on the pulse, so I guess I'm going a little easy here and saying 9-3 will be an acceptable but maybe not celebrated result, and then all eyes on next year. You're saying no, the expectation is going to be to make the playoff this year.
Well, go ahead, John. Go ahead. Well, I think a big part of this is like how the roster aligns. I mean, how do you win in major college football? How do you win the SEC? You are good on both lines. You're good on the offensive line and the defensive line. They got Nico probably for at least another year, but probably 4 of his starting 5 offensive linemen are gone after this year. On the defensive line, it's supposed to be the best position group on the team. You could lose all 4 starters. I mean, there's 3 guys that are going to start on the defensive line that played for Jeremy Pruitt. That's how old this defensive line is. And James Pierce is the other guy. He'll go to the NFL. So you're gonna wipe out most of your offensive line and most of your defensive line in this offseason. Now, they could replenish that. They could add some transfers. They've recruited well. But if you think about how people would react to what we're talking about, they would react to that during the season and then as late as December. And you don't know what a rebuilt roster for next year is going to look like during that time. So you're judging it on what they have now and what they will lose. And if you look through that lens, then the year to do it is this year, not next year.
John?
Yeah, that you could certainly look at it that way. Tennessee is recruiting very well, and it's got a robust NIL deal going, and obviously Tennessee can attract transfers. It's recruiting high school players well. So maybe even despite the losses, you would still think it would be good next year, and you just might have to lean more on the transfer portal. I think it's interesting what Tennessee did in the transfer portal this year. I think it added some key parts. I think Lance Hurd, LSU offensive tackle, was a big get for Tennessee. It was crucial that Tennessee solidified that offensive line. I still think there's one position maybe in question. I guess it's left guard, one of the guard spots. But other than that, this looks like a solid offensive line. And so I think fans look at it that way. I mean, they just look at it, this is Tennessee's year. And they go back. I also think they go back to 22. When you look at the 2022 season, that team had a great year, finished in the top 10. I know it got derailed against South Carolina in a really weird game and lost by 25 points. However, that team was hardly without flaws. Its secondary was porous. And yet it moved the ball so effectively. It scored so many points, gained so many yards. It still prevailed, even though the defense wasn't what you would think of as being a top flight SEC defense. So I think fans can look at it through, go back to 22 and think, well, you've got Nico at quarterback now instead of Hendon Hooker. He should be just as good, if not better. You've got a veteran offensive line. So Tennessee can just outscore these teams, even with the defensive shortcomings in the secondary and maybe at linebacker. I don't see a lot of proven depth there. The Tennessee will just be able to score enough points to prevail in the end. So I think that might have something to do with the expectations.
Very glass half full from you, John, throughout the preseason as it pertains to this defense, and just kind of like, well, the defense might allow 38 points per game. That's fine because the offense is going to score 42 points per game.
Well, you go back to those Florida and Alabama games in 22.
Yeah.
I mean, Anthony Richardson and Bryce Young, they wore at their arms completing passes.
Guys, is there any part of you with that when you saw Florida State lose to Georgia Tech in the Week 0 game that you thought maybe a 9-3 SEC team gets in this year? Florida State has a tough shot now. We know the ACC champion is getting in, but I feel like Georgia Tech's going to lose some. NC State's going to lose some. They play Tennessee and then some. Clemson plays Georgia. I don't know. Miami, I don't know. I mean, is Miami going to run the table? I just looked over there and thought, what if you've got like an undefeated SEC and an 11-1 and a 10-2 and a couple of 9-3s, and I don't know. When I saw Florida State lose, I thought they don't have to give the ACC or the Big 12 or whoever multiple teams. I just wonder if there's a path that Tennessee or another team could go 9-3. And get in if you've got just a whole lot of teams clustered together for those last couple spots.
There's no path for Tennessee to get in at 9-3 because who would their marquee win be at that point? NC State maybe in week 2. I mean, I guess they could beat Alabama and lose to 2 other teams. That's the scenario you've laid out, Adam, and your game by game. But I wonder, if you got 3 losses and one of them's to a middling Florida team, in all likelihood, I don't think that the opportunities are there with this schedule for Tennessee to get in at 9-3. There might be a team or 2 in the SEC that could do it. Alabama always seems to have some special ability to sway the committee's minds. I mean, they were the one team that made the playoff despite not making the conference championship game one year. I mean, last year, Greg Sankey did his Sesame Street routine and convinced the committee to take Alabama instead of undefeated Florida State. So, and Alabama's got a pretty tough schedule. So maybe if Alabama went 9-3, Oklahoma's got an absolutely brutal schedule. If they were to go 9-3 and you were looking for an extra team, maybe. I think there's going to be enough 10-2 teams from the SEC that it won't have to get to that point. But I think to your point, Adam, if it comes down to a 10-2 number 2 team from the ACC, excuse me, a 10-2 team from the ACC for the final at-large spot, or a 9-3 SEC team, I think you would have to seriously consider going with the 9-3 SEC team. I don't think it's going to get to that point, though. I just think there's going to be enough 10-2 teams that it won't get to that level.
Yeah, I guess in Tennessee's position, that would where their schedule would hurt them, because they would probably need 5 ranked teams to play, win 2, lose 3. But the way we're looking at it now, they would lose 3 and win 1, and yeah, one win over a ranked team, it wouldn't get you in. That's the drop off in their schedule from those ranked teams down to Mississippi State, Arkansas, Vandy. That would certainly hurt them if they got in that position.
I think the 2 SEC teams that could make it at 9-3 would be Oklahoma and Florida because of their schedules. And I don't think Florida's anywhere near a playoff. They'll be lucky to have a winning season. But Oklahoma, I think, has a pretty good team, but the schedule basically eliminates it from playoff consideration in my mind. Even though it's preseason top 20, it's just got to play all these nationally ranked teams, most of them on the road. If Oklahoma went through that schedule and it's, say, split 3-3 against nationally ranked teams, played a bunch of close games, and things go haywire in the Big 12 and ACC, they don't get an at-large team, I guess there's a possibility then. But I'm kind of with Blake on this. I just think there will be enough 10-2 SEC teams. I also wonder if the selection committee is going to be looking for a reason not to just overload this playoff with SEC teams. Everybody knows it's a preeminent conference. And if you've already got 4 in and now you're debating, well, does this 5th SEC team belong in? I think they would look for a reason, if all things would equal, and say, well, let's put that other team from a Big 12 in, or Big 10.
I do find it interesting how people are, John, I may have gotten the same email as you did, but I've gotten some other texts and emails, sort of a similar tone from Tennessee fans saying, Josh Heupel's got to win it this year, or else. Sometimes it's
or else what?
And I find it that interesting, and this is one point that I made to a couple of readers the other day. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the what's it called, the blue chip ratio. Blue chip ratio. It's that site. I think CBS maybe uses it. It measures like what your percentage of 5 stars and 4 stars are on a roster. So it's essentially just by the recruiting stars, you're gauging how deep and how talented a roster is. Tennessee, I think, I want to say they're like 8th in the SEC in the blue chip ratio. That they're not. It sort of looks like a team that's got some talented players, some really, really talented players, some playoff level players, but not enough of them yet. And I think sometimes the fan base, especially at this time of the year, they are linking Josh Heupel and Tennessee's recruiting wins, the recent recruiting wins, with the current team. I get a lot of this from fans of, they got a top 5 class. They're raking in 5 stars. They should win. Well, those guys aren't on campus right now. You're like 2 years away from seeing those guys make a difference. I do think the enthusiasm, Blake, you talked about, like a lot of fans are saying 9-3, and now they're leaning more towards 10-2. I think that's the enthusiasm drummed up by a lot of the recruiting wins they've had over the last month. But those, they don't play yet, and I think Tennessee is still in that sort of in that range of 8-4, 9-3, 10-2, and again, that's why I picked them 9-3. But we'll see. The SEC is. I think there's a lot of parity probably in the SEC, below Georgia, and probably as low as about the 8th or 9th team.
Well, Tennessee fans are enthusiastic for the season, harbor playoff expectations, and we know they're enthusiastic about Adam and John's work as well. You can find the coverage leading up to and after the season opener at knoxnews.com. Of course, the spotlight will brighten next week when Tennessee will be facing NC in week 2. First up, Chattanooga, and we'll be back with you next week to recap that game and look ahead to week 2 against NC State. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Volunteer State.